should have found essentially 4 pieces of information. The first is an upcoming tour. And we're going to be going to the Johnny Cash Boys at Home. The bus will leave from right out here in front of the museum on October 5th. And all the other information is on there. And if you want to sign up tonight, you can do that out at the front desk. The next thing is this quilt. We're raffling it off. If you want to buy chances, they're $4 a piece or 3 for $10. And you can buy those tonight as well. The next thing you'll find is just the list of lectures that are coming up. And then the last is, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do this. If you haven't become a member of the museum yet, fill it out tonight and become a member. Oh, and one last thing. Wednesday, we pick up a grant. We have been given a small museum grant by the Arkansas Department of Heritage. I guess it's actually the Department of Heritage and Parks now. That will allow us to put in a chairlift for the upstairs. Which means that we can move forward with raising money and doing something upstairs. So we will have that on Wednesday. All right, without further ado, let me tell you just a little bit about our speaker. Some of you have already met her. She was here, was it 2006?
2006, yeah.
All right. So Carla Behringer Rabinowitz is a descendant of our founders, Ransom Bettis and Thomas Drew. And so tonight she's going to be reading from and talking about her book, Borderers. Many of you have bought one and read it already. And this has kind of been a life's passion, right?
Well, for the last 17, 18 years. Anyway.
So I'm going to leave it to her to tell us more. So, welcome, Carla.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is wonderful. It's the biggest crowd I've had at one of these talks so far, even bigger than in my hometown where everybody knows me. In my hometown where everybody knows me, they were all interrupting me to ask questions during the whole thing. I would have to say, if people do that, I'm going to lose track of what I'm saying, and I'm going to go wandering off, and it's not going to make any sense. So could you please save questions for the end? I will take as much time as you want to answer questions at the end of the talk. As Rodney just said, I was here in 2006. I was actually invited by Judge Phil Smith, who had found me on the internet because of the research I had already done at that point on Thomas Stevenson Drew. And at that point, I was at the very beginning of my research. I knew almost nothing. I've discovered a great deal since then. But there's a little pamphlet out there in the front of the museum which has an essay I wrote a year or 2 after that. And I just checked it, and I am happy to report it doesn't contain any really embarrassing errors. So that is what I knew in, say, 2007. I know a great deal more now. And if anybody's finished the book, probably knows most of what I know. So when I was 50 years old, I got kind of interested in family history. And if there are people here who are fellow genealogy nuts, you know how it works. You get to be 50, the kids have left home, your grandparents are dead. You start wondering about your connections, about how you're connected to the past and the future, and so you get into genealogy. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. At least one person can identify with that. And because all the other branches of my family had been researched back to their original village in Germany or England or wherever, I got interested in the one branch of the family that had never been researched, about which we knew almost nothing. And those were the ancestors of my grandmother's mother's parents, Thomas Stevenson Drew and Cinderella Bettis Drew. And that, I think, it's another thing about doing genealogy searches that some people may relate to. The women get kind of washed out of the family history. All the essays in the family genealogies tend to be about the men, who are do much more public and interesting things. So anyway, I wanted to find out about my grandmother's grandmother. And at that point, the only thing we knew about Thomas Drew was that he had been a governor of Arkansas, and that he was the only governor of Arkansas ever to quit because they weren't paying him enough. And after a little while, I discovered something else. Because I'm the oldest sibling of the oldest sibling, and I'm the only person in the family with an attic. All these family documents and memorabilia came down to me, and there they all were, and some of them I haven't read and will probably never read. But one thing I found was a green folder which had scraps of writing by Thomas Stevenson Drew. They were drafts of things. They were nothing finished, but a draft of a letter here, a draft of an article he wanted to send to a newspaper there, a draft of a rather confusing and poorly researched, reasoned brief in a trial involving citizens of the Cherokee Nation, and a very interesting first draft of his 1853 report as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. One of the interesting things was he went off on one tack, so really speaking honestly about the feelings of the Indians in Indian Territory about a bill that had been proposed by Senator Robert Johnson that would abolish all of their sovereignty. And I could see in the draft that he had crossed that whole section out and started over again. And he started over much more cautiously and much more deferentially. And, you know, didn't want to offend anybody. This is a perfectly nice bill, you know, maybe if you give the Indians some time to accept or reject it and think about it, maybe the intelligent ones will probably come around. Total nonsense. They hated it. You know, there was violent, passionate, unanimous opposition to this bill in Indian Territory. But Thomas Drew, because of his political situation, could only hint at that in the most cautious way. So I got kind of interested. This was my first introduction to the question of who is this guy? What kind of a person was he? And what were the circumstances that had formed him? And in looking for the answer to that, I also, of course, got into the history of the Bettis family, and I followed them all back. And I followed them back to the beginning of the 18th century, around the edges of the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia. The Drews were on the western side of the Great Dismal Swamp. The Bettises were on the southern side of the Great Dismal Swamp, and they didn't meet up for another 100 years. From there, I followed the two families westward on their journeys across the continent, which eventually took them all the way from Virginia to California. And I realized very early on that my ancestors themselves were much less interesting than what was happening around them. Because what was happening around them, as I began to see it, was the birth of America. There were changes, political, spiritual, social, religious changes going on around them, the whole length of the journey that as they traveled, that were shaping them, shaping their contemporaries into the people we recognize ourselves as today, the things that people talk about when they talk about Americans. Of course, they're not uniform across this country, which is bigger and much, much more diverse than it used to be. But there's a bit of the spirit that survives, that was being formed back then. And I was also discovering things I had never known about American history, things that nobody knows, that they don't tell you in American history books. And that became the reason for the book. That's what kept me going for 17 years. So how did I do it? How did I find out what was going on here? Basically, I started out on the internet, and it was a lot easier back then. If I had started 10 years later, the book would never have been written. Because back then, there were things on the internet called genealogy chat rooms, where you could connect with anybody who was doing research on the same family name and share your research, correct each other's errors, ask questions, don't exist anymore because they couldn't monetize them. Ancestry.com is nowhere near as useful as these vanished chat rooms used to be. They're a great loss. One of the people I met through these chat rooms was a man named Lou Poole in Texas, who wasn't even a Drew descendant. He was married to a Drew descendant. And he sent me 100-paged files of all the Drew ancestors and descendants, and the ancestors and descendants of Thomas's mother's family, the Maxwells. He just was, like many, many genealogists, so enthusiastic about the research he had done. Every document, every will, every deed that was in any records, and he just couldn't wait to share them. And then on the Bettis side, there was a quite different manuscript, which was typewritten in 1951 by an elderly lady called Adele Cobb Kerrigan, who wasn't a descendant of these Bettises, but of some of their cousins. And she had a lot of information, a lot of fantasy, a lot of errors, a lot of imagination, and a psychic horse. She asked the psychic horse what county in Virginia her original Bettis ancestor had come from, and the horse responded by tapping her hoof, and she got her answer. But she gave me the names of the ancestors, more or less accurately, and I could find them in the records and find out about their lives and what they went through. So my central question, one of the central questions, as I was doing this research, became, who was Thomas Stevenson Drew? What kind of a person was he? And I came to see him in terms of several different characteristics. The one that strikes me most forcefully was that he was a conciliator. He was always trying to reconcile opposing sides in a conflict, make peace between enemies, find compromises. I respond to this because I'm a professional mediator. I can kind of understand the impulse that leads people to want to do that. He had appallingly poor business judgment. And you can see that over and over again in the story of his life. He just reels from one business disaster to another. But he was an incorrigible optimist. Every time he failed at one thing, he went off, found something else to do, tried to do that, failed again, tried something else, tried something new. Till the end of his life, he was still trying to get back the fortune that he had lost in the middle of his life. To me, he was a decent guy. He was complex. He tried to do the right thing. He was a man who laid great stress on principle. And ultimately, he was kind of a tragic figure, just because of the endless hope and the endless disappointments. So the question, what shows that he was a conciliator? And the earliest example of that is his role in the Arkansas Constitutional Convention. The convention was deadlocked on the question of representation. The North and West of state had, and the South and East, had exactly equal numbers of convention delegates. And the North and West insisted that representation in the legislature should be only by number of free white males, whereas the South and East, where the rich slaveholding population was the white population was much thinner, but there were a lot more slaves, and they wanted land representation apportioned in the same way as in the first United States Constitution. Each white man counted as one person, and each slave as 3/5 of a person. That's not familiar. That's you know, one of the things at, you know, right at the beginning of our history that shows what was going on. So the convention was deadlocked, and Thomas Drew proposed a compromise. The compromise was that in the final constitution, each of the two major sections would have exactly the same number of districts, but there would be an extra district right in the center, centered around Little Rock. Little Rock was a rich area with a lot of connections to the slaveholding counties of the South and East. And so that would seem to be an advantage for the South and East. But as the state grew and new districts got added, the population grew. From then on, population would be, not population, representation would be allocated on the basis of free white males only. So it was a short-term victory for one side, a long-term victory for the other. And it was referred to a committee of 3 people to report back on whether this was a good compromise. The chair of the committee was Thomas Drew. They reported back. It was a good compromise, and that's what went into the original Arkansas Constitution. Well, then there was a letter that I found in that green folder. This was a letter to, I don't know what newspaper, it was a draft of a letter to whatever newspaper it was, written right on the eve of the Civil War, 1830. And in this letter, he was supporting the nomination of Douglas as the Democratic candidate for president, favored by the Northern Democrats, as opposed to Breckinridge, who was favored by the Southern Democrats. And he goes into this very low-key, very well-reasoned, very lawyerly argument. Everybody else was spouting fire-breathing rhetoric and damning and demonizing the other side. Thomas Drew was being very reasonable, very conciliatory. He says that even if Douglas becomes president, he's the only president who can beat Lincoln, only candidate who can beat Lincoln. It doesn't involve any problem with Southern honor. It doesn't involve any danger to the Southern economy. And he also argues that the United States Constitution obviously allows no right of secession. Completely doomed argument. Obviously, at that point, the Union was beyond saving, but he was trying. He was doing his best to find a middle ground between two sides which, within a year or so, were trying to wipe each other out. Didn't work, but that was the fate of many of his initiatives. Then there's the question of, how do I know he was a terrible businessman? Well, you all know that he, at the founding of, when Bettis Ferry became Pocahontas, he donated 15 square blocks of city land, which are now the town center. And this was land that he owned. He gave it to the town on the condition that the courthouse be built there. And that was the peak of his fortune. After that moment, after that point when he was the town's founder and greatest benefactor, everything slowly and then more and more quickly went downhill. And I've never been able to figure out the exact mechanics of why everything went downhill. But I'm fairly sure it had something to do with the catastrophe of the 2 state banks. The Constitution that had been passed, I see somebody nodding over there, allowed for the establishment of 2 state banks, the State Bank of Arkansas, the Real Estate Bank of Arkansas. And I don't exactly know why the State Bank failed, but the Real Estate Bank was built on complete fantasy. The people could buy shares in the real estate bank with land or crops, even if the land was mortgaged. The land was supposed to be cleared and planted, but in many cases it wasn't. And that mortgaged land became collateral for the bonds issued by the bank. And if you can't follow this, don't worry, I couldn't either. But in such a way that the bank's shareholders got all the profits and the state guaranteed the bonds and assumed all the risks. And one half of your shares in the bank could be used as collateral for another mortgage to buy more property, which could then be used to purchase more shares. If this sounds faintly familiar, privatization of profits, socialization of risk, and the creation of imaginary money by repeated transfers of assets, think back to 2007. It's the same deal. The land, oh, by the way, the appraisers for the land were in the pay of the landowners, who also controlled the bank. So it was basically a means for the landowners to plunder the state and plunder the bank. Very much, if you're thinking collateralized debt obligations, crash of 2007, same thing, same type of fantasy, the creation of imaginary money by transfers of overvalued assets. The bank failed within 2 years. So did the State Bank of Arkansas. Thomas Drew was one of the directors of the Batesville branch of the real estate bank, which had been criticized for making too many loans to its directors. One suspects that some of those loans may have been made to Thomas Drew. I haven't been able to find any documentation of that. It is all, but I do know that immediately after the bank was founded, both Thomas and his father-in-law, Ransom Bettis, went on a land buying spree. They bought a lot of town land in Pocahontas and a lot of agricultural land to the east. And then they seem to trade it around a lot because the tax lists are just bizarre. You know, one year Thomas owns 1,000, next year he owns 250, and a neighbor of his has gone from 300 to 1,000, and then it goes back again. So I don't know what they were doing there, but it was not a good plan, whatever it was. Ransom sold all his land, town land and the agricultural land, sold it very quickly and at a good profit. Thomas sold the town land and held on to the agricultural land. Probably land not yet cleared, probably swampland. Held on to it either in the hope of reselling it at a profit when the land went even higher, or maybe of establishing a larger plantation. The banks collapsed. Thomas couldn't pay his debts. He couldn't sell the land. Everything was going south. And that is probably what destroyed whatever fortune he had and kept him spending the rest of his life trying to make it back. In 1850, he gave up. This was after he had quit the governorship because they wouldn't pay him enough to pay his debts. Sold all his land to his mother-in-law, Mary Kelly Bettis. Here's the word I don't know how to pronounce. Deshaw County, is that it? Deshay. Okay. He moved to Deshay County with 28 slaves, probably hoping to establish a cotton plantation there, because that area of the Delta was in the process of being cleared for cotton plantations. A horrendous, hellish job. It involved cutting down and digging up the roots of every tree, shrub, plant, burning them all, taking everything down to bare ground, and making it suitable for cotton. The work was done by slaves. The land was swampland, a lot of it. It was malarial. People died like flies. The white owners generally lived up in the hills where there weren't as many mosquitoes. This didn't work either. In only 1 year, Thomas gave up. He sold half of his slaves to his rich brother-in-law James in Louisiana and moved in with his wife's 6 children and his mother-in-law to one of James's plantations. Oh, he sold all his farming equipment to James as well. And we have an 1850 census, a slave census, giving names, giving ages of the people that Thomas owned. And we also have the deed by which he sold half of those people to his brother. And they're quite interesting, because the half of the people that he sold to his brother were apparently families with young children, children under about 12. The other half of the slaves who appeared in the census went somewhere else. They either went to another planter who was more ruthless and energetic in getting land cleared, or they were sold down the river to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. An utterly hellish journey to an even more hellish destination. They were probably, the people he sold were probably the children or siblings of the people that he tried to protect by selling them to his brother. So the moral complications here, the difficulty of being a decent human being in that system really show up in those 2 documents. So he lived for a year or maybe 2 in Louisiana on his brother's plantation, and in 1853 he probably used his political connections to get himself appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern Superintendency. There were 7 superintendents, each of them responsible for a different set of tribes in a different area of the country. And 5 of the other 6 wrote reports in 1853, all of which are attached to the report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Wrote reports in which they portrayed themselves as overseers or tutors, benevolent despots of the Indians for whom they were responsible. Their main job, as they saw it, was to report on the progress of these people towards civilization. Thomas's 1853 report, which is the one I found the draft of in my attic, was entirely different, because he wrote as an ally and an advocate for the 5 nations in Indian territory for whom he was responsible. They were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes, known as the 5 civilized tribes, all of them living in what is now Oklahoma. And there are clues in the record that this might have had something to do with a friendship that he formed with Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross, who in one of his letters, Ross invited Drew to come and see for himself the good things that were happening in the Cherokee Nation under Ross's leadership. And if you study what Ross's concerns were, what he was advocating for, what he wanted to accomplish, and then you read Thomas's report, Thomas is using Ross's words. He is advocating, supporting Ross in everything Ross wanted. And the interesting thing is that his superior, Commissioner Manypenny, responded positively. He actually quoted Drew by name and remarked favorably on his report in at least one of those areas. But he also, in that same report, gave this very cautious, very timid criticism of Senator Johnson's bill abolishing the sovereignty of those nations. And that is something that may have contributed to doing him in, but it wasn't the killer. The fatal error occurred towards the end of 1854, and I found a tiny clue to it when I was in the Federal Archives looking through the correspondence of Commissioner Moneypenny. And Moneypenny said, there was a brief reference to something involving the Beams family, and we never want to see this happen again. And so I went looking for the Beams family, and I found them in a fascinating article by a husband and wife team called Daniel and Marianne Littlefield, which no Drew researcher had ever uncovered before. It was a totally unknown episode of Thomas Drew's life. And now I'm going to read you about it. Even as Drew sat down to write his 1854 report, the train wreck of his newest career was already underway. It had been set in motion 22 years earlier, and by the time it smashed into Drew, it had involved at least 70 people in an epic of greed, betrayal, pursuit, and defense spanning an entire generation. 3 secretaries of war, a secretary of the Interior, 2 United States Attorneys General, 3 commissioners of Indian Affairs, a couple of generations of Choctaw chiefs, and 3 Southern superintendents were involved in it before it finally ended. The story takes place against a background of changing attitude towards slaves and free people of color among the Indian nations. The severity of the laws dealing with slavery varied widely among the 5 civilized tribes. Seminole slaves enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, and free people of color were treated like any other Seminole citizens, while the far more restrictive Cherokee laws closely paralleled those of their white neighbors. In the early years of the 19th century, Creek and Choctaw laws and customs held a place between those 2 extremes. After the Indian removal in the Trail of Tears, the views of the slaveholding elites in Indian territory increasingly converged with those of whites, and the teachings of pro-slavery missionaries reinforced the trend. Among the Creeks, slaves lost their right to own property, and free people of color were made subject to a property tax. In the somewhat more lenient Choctaw Nation after 1838, a slave owner could teach his or her slaves to read and write, but no one else could do it without the owner's consent. And after 1844, no free person of color unconnected with Choctaw blood could receive any money from the Choctaw annuity. The kidnapping and enslavement of free people of color was a highly lucrative business in the mid-19th century. And as their status declined with the advent of the Civil War and the protection of their neighbors disappeared, free people of color in the Choctaw Nation became attractive targets. In 1823, a white man named William Beams, a citizen of the Choctaw Nation by virtue of his previous marriage to a Choctaw woman, took his enslaved African-American second wife, Nellie, and a dozen of their children and grandchildren from Mississippi to Illinois to set them free. They then returned to the Choctaw Nation, where Beams announced the emancipation of his African-American family. Nellie and her children lived there as free people for the next 5 years, until Beams divided his estate among his 4 Choctaw children and returned with the rest of his family to Illinois. After his death, his African-American family made the mistake of returning home. In 1832, although Nellie and all of her children had been registered as free by the Mississippi courts, their Choctaw half-siblings decided to sell them. It is here that John B. Davis first appears, at the beginning of his obsessive, decades-long struggle for ownership of the African-American Beams. The Choctaw Beams siblings either sold their African American siblings to him or contracted with him to sell them in any way he could in exchange for half the profits. He and his associate rounded up the entire family and kept them captive for a year until the Choctaw chief finally intervened and ordered them released. 7 years later, we're now in 1839, when the number of African American Beams descendants had grown to between 25 and 30, all now living in Indian Territory, Davis tried again. By misrepresenting the true status of the Beams family, he succeeded in manipulating the United States Attorney General, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the Secretary of War, and the Brigadier General in command of Fort Gibson into ordering their capture. The family was protected, however, by lower-level federal officers who knew they were free, and by then Southern Superintendent Armstrong, who knew that they were free and who dodged and delayed until the commissioner finally allowed him to use his discretion and send Davis packing. In 1840, Davis sold his claim to the family to a man named Fowler, who didn't bother with politicians but simply hired kidnappers. The kidnappers succeeded in capturing 4 family members and killing 1. Fowler was tried for kidnapping but acquitted, and the 4 captured women were sold into slavery and never recovered. In 1844, after Davis's claim had been sold and resold several times, a 3rd buyer captured a few more, was arrested by federal troops, tried, and also acquitted. The decline in the status of free people of color within the Choctaw Nation in the preceding 12 years can be seen in the fact that this time, instead of helping the Beams family members, the Choctaw chiefs actually assisted in their capture. 2 years after that, Chester Ashley, then a United States Senator, took the 3rd man's claim to a 2nd Secretary of War. At the same time, Davis himself appealed to the same secretary, having decided that the Beams were still his. The 2nd Secretary of War and a 2nd commissioner ordered a 2nd Southern Superintendent to give up the Beams family, but the claimants got nowhere. The family, by then numbering about 50 people and representing a sizable fortune to whoever could capture them, decided that they would be safer if they separated, and several of them settled in the Creek Nation, where they lived in safety for a while. 8 years later, in the summer of 1854, the pursuers arrived at Thomas Drew's door. Drew was, of course, the 3rd superintendent to have to deal with this enormous problem. Davis, still carrying on his obsessive pursuit of the family, had appealed to a 3rd Secretary of War, this time Jefferson Davis, who referred the matter to a 2nd United States Attorney General. Once again, Davis lied, misrepresenting the issue as one of the fugitive slave law in Indian Territory, while ignoring the fact that the Beams family were neither fugitives nor slaves. The Attorney General ruled that Davis or his agents had the right under the fugitive slave law to enter the Choctaw Nation to retrieve any slaves who belonged to him. Drew, the 3rd Southern Superintendent to have dealt with this issue, refused to assist him without instructions from his superiors. But then he fumbled. On July 23rd, the Choctaw agent, Douglas Cooper, requested instructions from the Secretary of the Interior. Secretary did not get around to answering until September 11th, when he told Cooper to take no action until the facts were investigated, definitive instructions received. But by then, it was too late. On July 27th, Davis's agent, a man named Hauser, had returned to pester Drew again and found him preparing to leave for a month's visit with his family, some of whom were ill. His family, by the way, when Drew was in Fort Smith at this point, his family was back in Pocahontas. He didn't bring them with him. Since the Creek agent was also unavailable for an unspecified amount of time, Nobody was in charge. Any order arriving from Washington during Drew's and the agent's absence would simply have warned the family members to flee. The harried Drew agreed to give Hauser a letter ordering the Creek chiefs to assist Davis in capturing those members of the family who were living in the Creek Nation. When questioned about the letter later, Drew first denied having written it, then said it had been given to Hauser with the oral understanding that it was not to be used until approval for the action was received from Washington. That understanding had not been stated in the document, and no copy was kept. Davis and his agents had finally found the weak link in the chain of protection that had maintained the family's freedom for so long. Hauser took the order to Choctaw Agent Cooper, along with a copy of the letter from Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, saying that the Attorney General had ruled that the fugitive slave law applied. Cooper, who knew that the family was free and that the law was therefore irrelevant, refused to act. Hauser then went to the Choctaw chiefs and lied once again, telling them that Jefferson Davis had said that the Attorney General had ruled that the Beams were slaves and that Cooper had promised to have those in the Choctaw Nation rounded up and delivered to the superintendent in Van Buren. That lie succeeded in gaining in possession of 5 family members from the Choctaw Nation, plus 2 from the Creeks. He took them to the Cherokee Nation to sell them, but there, finally, his luck turned. A missionary named Worcester recognized the family members and intervened. Worcester appealed to the Secretary of the Interior and to Jefferson Davis, who responded indignantly that he would abhor any act that deprives a free man of his rights and perverts a constitutional law to such base purposes. By this time, however, the captured family members had been sold. As soon as they heard of their capture, friends of the Beams family went to court to sue for their freedom. Drew was called on the carpet for acting without authorization and directed to hire counsel in Arkansas courts to make every effort to have them freed. In yet another bizarre wrinkle, the sole survivor of the Choctaw Beams children joined the suit, claiming that Davis had never paid them the agreed-upon price for their stepmother, siblings, nieces, and nephews, and that as a result, all of them still belonged to her. The captured family members were released until the conclusion of the 2 trials, which did not come for another year and a half. In both cases, the Arkansas juries immediately decided that the Beams were free. Such quick decisions seem surprising given the animosity against free people of color that was gathering force in Arkansas at that time. They may reflect the fact that Northwest Arkansas, where the trial would have been held, still had very few slaves, and only 3 years later, a very high level of pro-union sentiment, including actual Union militias and guerrilla bands who resisted the Confederates. The outcome was not so happy for Thomas Drew, who had been fired in April of 1855. His former supporter, Commissioner Manypenny, wrote to the Secretary of the Interior on February 2nd, 1855, that, quote, "In my opinion, the facts developed in the papers emanating from Mr. Drew himself are sufficient to justify his removal from office without any further investigation." Poor judgment. Bad mistake, one of a series of very bad mistakes. After he was fired as superintendent, he set up a law practice in Fort Smith, and we find him there in 1860. And that's where that mysterious draft of the brief in the trial of the Cherokee citizens comes into play. Because some of the names of the people involved in that suit are names of close associates and family members of Chief Ross. So it looks like he was building on his connections within the Cherokee nations to support his law practice. It didn't win. He was advocating an argument that had been rejected several years back decisively. There was no chance he was going to win that. Later on in 1860, we find him in Clarksville, writing that letter supporting the nomination of Stephen Douglas as Democratic candidate and arguing against secession. And here again, you can see him as optimistic, naively, stubbornly optimistic, but determined. And one of the things about him that shows up in this letter is that the key word all through the letter is principle. In fact, it's the very last word in the last sentence of the letter. He was a man completely dedicated to principle as he saw it. Sometimes he couldn't manage to reconcile his conduct with his principles, but he cared about principle. In 1863, his family had moved down the river to Dardanelle, and on September 12, 1863, Dardanelle was sacked by Union troops and burned. The Drew family fled. None of them were killed, but there was, in the aftermath of that attack, there was starvation, there was guerrilla terrorism by guerrilla bands with no allegiance to either side, and complete collapse of civil society and government. The courts were closed, government shut down, the jails were open. It wasn't even the law of the jungle. There was no law whatsoever, and so anybody who could get out, got out. 2 years later, 1865, the Pocahontas, they were back in Pocahontas, and it was apparently occupied by Union troops at that point. And it's not quite clear whether Guy Bennett was quartered in Drew's house or whether it was just one of his friends who was quartered and Guy Bennett came to visit. But in 1865, Drew's middle daughter, Sadie, my great-great-grandfather, married this Union. He was a sutler. He wasn't an army officer. He arranged provisions for the Union Army. And she followed him to Illinois and got married there only weeks after the end of the war. 1866, Drew was working as a bookkeeper in a general store in Pocahontas. A substantial amount of his salary is being withheld to pay his family's account for groceries at that store. When he tries to set up another law practice, he's replaced by somebody else who boards with the Drew family, and on the condition that instead of paying rent, half of the new guy's, or same amount of the new guy's salary will go to the Drew family's account for groceries at the general store. He does appear in the documents for one trial in the period between 1866 and 1872, trial of a notorious murderer. He was aided by a Judge Henderson, who was an old family friend. The guy did not get off. He was hanged anyway. And in 1872, Cinderella died, and Drew went off to California, still hoping to regain his lost fortune. And he may have done it. It's not clear. According to what he told his family and friends when he got back to Texas, he actually succeeded in making $30,000 from a very profitable lawsuit that had been steered his way by his cousin, John Coffey Hayes, who was the founder of Oakland, among other things. The only problem was that on the way back, the stagecoach was robbed and the money was stolen, with the exception of $3,000 that they had hidden under the floor of the stagecoach. This is the story as Drew told it. I don't want to question my great-great-grandfather, but that's the story that has gone down among his descendants. And he died in 1879 and was buried. And that's basically what I know about Thomas Drew. The rest of the details are in the book. And if anybody has any questions, I would be glad to answer them. Oh, yes, Linda.
About the Drew and the Bettis families.
Yeah?
When did they get together? Because wasn't Thomas Drew down in South Arkansas before he came up here to
He
the
was
see
in South
Cinderella?
Arkansas doing various things. He was a clerk of courts, he was general of militia, he did some other official job, and he had a postal route. And he both managed the post office and had postal routes initially, but then the government said you can't do that, so he chose the postal routes, which made more money. And he, the main postal route took him up the Southwest Trail to Greenville, Missouri, where the Bettises were living at the time. And presumably that's where he met Cinderella, that's where they were married in 1827.
Wow.
So, and then the Bettises, bit by bit, they all moved down here to Pocahontas. Yes,
Ransom or Ranson?
started as Ransom and became Ranson during the family's stay in Missouri. I know that because there is an affidavit in a lawsuit that in which Ransom was signing the affidavit. He's a witness to this lawsuit. At the top of the affidavit, it's spelled one way, and it's signed the other way. I also know it because I know who he was named after, who was a guy named Ransom Sutherland in North Carolina, spelled with an M. But by the time he got here, he was Ranson. So you can spell it either way or both. Yes?
Has Governor Thomas Drew not passed that a woman, well, the property a woman brings to the marriage is hers?
Right.
Do you think Cinderella influenced him in that?
Could quite easily be because the records say that she immediately took advantage of it. She registered her property that she got from her mother in such a way that it could not be taken from her husband's debts. The law had been proposed before, and the former governor, who was Governor Yell, had vetoed it. But Thomas did not.
Following up on that, Archibald Yell, I have read that he was married here at Bettis's house in Pocahontas.
Really?
Others have told me he was married. He was married at Old Jackson, which is the county seat at the time.
I cannot answer that. That's not a fact I've ever stumbled across. Linda?
We have discovered that Governor Drew was the first governor to proclaim Thanksgiving as a state holiday. Are
Right.
you familiar with that?
I have heard that, yeah.
So we're having a festival in November in honor of Governor Drew having named
Well, that's great.
Yes.
He needs to have some respect and some recognition.
Yes,
Because he had a tough life.
Well, he's winning. He's winning in Pocahontas now.
Oh, that's good. Anything else? Anybody else? I will be, if anybody has books they would like me to sign, I'd be happy to sign them. I was unaware when I came down here how many books the museum had already sold of the ones that they originally bought. So they only had about 3 on the shelf when I came in this afternoon. In the unlikely event that there are more people who want to buy books than there are books to be bought, I've got order forms, and I can write on the order form, hold for signature. When I get back, I will sign the order form. I will sign the book, and my publisher will send the book to the person who sent the order form. But anyway.
All right, we don't have any more questions. We're going to turn it over to Bill Carroll for just a moment.
Okay.
The Five Rivers Historic Preservation occasionally presents the Ransom Bettis Award for historical research into our local history. history, you know, is a story, it's many stories, but it's not a static story, it changes. And that's due to the research that people like Carla do, and all those musty documents in her attic and elsewhere, I'm sure. So I'd like to, at this time, present you with the Ransom Bettis Award.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Research, yeah.
That's wonderful.
She's definitely
Yeah,
one.
which one's on the plaque?
Yeah, is it M or N? The spelling on the
I
plaque.
spelled
Oh,
it in.
it's spelled with an M.
Oh, good, all right, good, good. Well, that was great.